So welcome back. We're looking forward to continue in Tezvav. We did mention in the past few classes, this is a lengthier chapter, for that matter. In the previous introductions, perhaps even on most of the classes on the Sigeres, we pointed out the uniqueness of this chapter, thus lengthier, for sure, that the Alter Rebbe itemizes and identifies every one of the 10 sfirot, known to as Chochma, Bina, Das, which is of course the cognitive faculties, and the Midot, which are the attributes of the human being, which correspond to on high, as we mentioned, known as Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus, which in Chassidus is of course fundamental. The Alter Rebbe alludes to it in the very beginning of the Likutei Amarim, which is the first segment of Tanya. We're learning now the fourth, Igeres HaKodesh, and because it's so vital to understand the way the soul, the Nefesh Elikis, works, and the Nefesh Bahamis, the godly soul, the Nefesh Bahamis, the animal soul, and so on, as Alter Rebbe continues in the subsequent chapters thereafter, Gimel, the third which we towards the very beginning of Likutei Amarim, and then in Vav he speaks about the counterpart of the Nefesh Elikis, is of course the Nefesh Bahamis, its midas, the way they function. Yet, in the same token, we pointed out that Alter Rebbe does not elaborate there in every one of the midas. A little more the Chachma Bina, the Das, which is a separate few lines towards the end of the chapter, Gimel. When it comes to the midas, he speaks about the chief midas, which is Chesed and Gvura, and he clearly says all the other five, that would be Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus, are branches, Anfei Ha'ava Vayira, the branches of love and fear, which would be, of course, Chesed and Gvura. In this Igeres is kind of the first time the Alter Rebbe mentions periodically the other midas, but in this Igeres, in this presentation, Alter Rebbe goes through all the midas with detail and specificity, and therefore it is indeed a longer chapter. Take us quite a while to go on, but we can appreciate it because this is really where we get to know what these midas are all about, their function, how, in the end of the day, as the Alter Rebbe himself speaks about the way these midas work in the interaction of man and a fellow friend, or teacher and pupil, father and son, and then, of course, he goes on to the ultimate, which is the relationship of Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there's a lot of detail in this chapter, but nonetheless, very exciting chapter indeed, because this is where we really know the character of each one of these attributes, each one of these characters, which is again the Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus. So last week, if you recall, we did Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes. And now we're holding, which is on page Kufchav Beis, which is the fourth line from the bottom, the final word, abbreviation, of Kuf Chav Beis, and the opposite page would be 242. In the original text, you can see it in the corresponding English text, or wherever you're watching, I will just say, as we do, namely for the newcomers, wherever you're watching it, but there's an advantage of the original website, which is Tanya Online, one word, tanyaonline.com. You have all the previous classes lined up. As an example, I believe this is the fifth class on this very epistle. To know what we're talking about in the overall. So if you're following, but if you're new to it, it's easy to access the previous classes. It's right on the left side of the screen, and it's the more recent classes are on top of the lineup. And though in the end of the day, it has all the previous classes from the very beginning of Likutei Amarim, beginning with the first segment we mentioned many times. Tanya has 5 segments. For that matter, there's precision to that as well. This is the Torah Shebiksab of Torah Achsidus, the written Torah of Torah Achsidus, thus the number 5. And we have all the classes lined up from the very beginning of Likutei Amarim. It's also the advantage, many times we reference different ideas, which instead of elaborating on them, we just focus on a different pedic, and it's really a click away, or another chapter where it's spoken about in a little more length and elaboration, so it's really a click away to take advantage of it, but namely in this chapter, to understand what it's, even though we do have this, we did mention time and again, the Alter Rebbe goes through all the 10 sfiras, but nonetheless, the backdrop, its overall context, and the Alter Rebbe has a beautiful piece in the very beginning of how in one hand the neshama does indeed reflect the Anhai, on the other hand, we should never make a mistake that the Anhai is kind of parallel to the way we understand and appreciate things below. No, the Anhai is truly absolutely Anhai, and therefore from a certain perspective and point of view there is no comparison, yet in the same token the neshama does come from Anhai, and indeed there are similarities. Again, the reason why we have that expression of chesed and gvura and tiferes and netzach in its full measure of expression is because Nishtalshul Mihen Al Rebbe has this expression at the very beginning, again, Likutei Amarim, the third chapter, which we spoke about earlier, because Nishtalshul Mihen, we come from the above, we evolve from the Anhai all the way up to Eilam Atzilus, that world of oneness, that world of unadulterated purity and oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's where the neshama comes from. It's a chelik elokah mimal mamash. It's mamash, part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and as the Alter Rebbe explains in the second chapter of Likutei Amarim. Right? This is the 15th of Igeres HaKodesh, but Likutei Amarim, the very first segment, the second chapter, it begins. The Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael is part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and part of the dynamic of Eilam Atzilus, where, as we spoke so many times, Lo Yugur Chara, there's not even subtle, nothing. It's all about a world which is Loshin, is Iu v'Chayoy Chad, Hashem and His Eires are one. Hashem is Iu v'Garmai Chad, Hashem and His the Kalim, the container of Atzilus. It's all one. It's a world that houses the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore every midah carries this sense of Ein Sofness to it. Chesed is bli gvul. Gvura has Ein Sof to it. Is Ein Sof to the midah of Gvura, because it's a world that houses the Ein Sof. Again, we spoke many times. We can't, of course, appreciate it just succinctly in this manner, because there's so much spoken about, and we spoke about this also in the chapters Lamed Ches and Lamed Tes, 39th. Likutei Amarim, it's worth to review that chapter to understand that Atzilus is not just a world just over Bria, but it's a different phenomenon completely. That's where the neshama comes from. And therefore, if Nishtal Shalom Mihen, in the end of the day, the Yid has all the spheres set up, and of course it establishes itself in its counterpart, which is the Nefesh Bahamis, all the 10 spheres, because Zel Umazel, so the King Hashem created everything with their counterpart accordingly. So, we did mention, and we'll say this again also, the backdrop of Igeres HaKodesh. In the overall backdrop, we had a very clear presentation at the very beginning of the Igeres Yud, which is the 10th epistle, which is 5 back. And worthwhile to see it, because again we took some time, and we always reference the information of the backdrop, because okay, to that chapter, so we need not to repeat. So let's go on. So see here the Alter Rebbe, again you got to see the very last week's class number 4, to see the Alter Rebbe starts with Chesed and Gvura, Tiferes, but this is still on very much on the emotional expression, but the ultimate point is that it should manifest, it should materialize, and it should be actualized. Is an example, somebody, let's say, just a bold example, somebody very, very clear idea of emotions. The ultimate objective of the emotions are meant to be manifest in actuality. Someone comes to your door, they're poor, vulnerable, and they want a piece of bread, and you demonstrate your sensation towards their vulnerability, identify with them, speak kind words, or even before you speak kind words, it becomes very indicative that you feel and you identify with them. But of course that's not enough. Imagine someone demonstrates that feeling even before they put it in words, and the other party perhaps could even feel it, but then right thereafter they close the door on that party. There's something missing, and beyond something missing, the point is that these feelings, these emotions, come to fruition. If it's good words, kind words, which of course penetrate the heart of the vulnerable. But beyond that, if they're hungry, they're physically hungry, and they're at loss because they don't have the access to this which they need, and you go and you serve them a warm meal, that is ultimately taking your emotions and actualizing them, bringing them into reality, realizing them. And that's what's so important to the recipient. So does it mean that you should just be robotic and just serve them the hot meal, or try to put on a tape recorder which would, or tape recorder, the good old time, just put on some recording which has words of kindness, of course that's not enough. For that matter, even halacha, the Gemara says if you just do that, you're missing out an important part of the mitzvah, and to the extent you're fragmenting or you're compromising, better said, your reward towards this which you're doing for the poor, because it's important that we wholeheartedly identify with the poor, with the vulnerable, with that party which is standing and begging for your help. So it's important we identify, we demonstrate our emotions towards their situation. Then beyond that, we talk, meaning to say that talking is already a step of materializing or actualizing, realizing your emotions. Not only you're emoting, but you're talking to them. They can actually hear, not only feel the connection, but they hear words of consolation, hear words of comfort and of actual help, suggesting help, namely identifying with their tzara, with their difficulty. That's one step in realizing you're bringing your emotions into fruition, into actuality. It means you're talking, you're expressing those words of kindness and compassion. But then beyond that, of course, to the poor, especially someone's hungry, that's not enough. It's not sufficient. It's important, but it's not sufficient. They're actually hungry and they need something to eat. And you give them a full warm meal, or they're after lodging, as an example. That's called taking the emotions and bringing it to actuality. And understand that every part of the picture is important. Though, from the perspective of the hungry body, the latter is important, but the whole, the psychological, emotional state of the vulnerable, every detail is important. So the Alter Rebbe last week begins with the Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, which is still on the emoting experience of the Nefesh. But the Alter Rebbe begins to then now, we continue, when it has to come to action, then when you actually give, when you extend yourself, you have to consult, deliberate with yourself how to give, in a way that the recipient should be able seamlessly to receive this which you want to give. So, we gave an example of actual help. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, compassion, and we think about it again, someone actually needs help, financial help, or they're hungry, they need to eat or so, because they are hungry, vulnerable, and so on. But of course, it's not limited to that example or that scenario. It could be a teacher and a pupil. He wants to extend a certain thought and ultimately a way of thinking, especially talking about a Torah teacher which wants to invest and wants to imbue the spirit of Torah, the information of Torah to his pupil, which is also some type of giving, or it is actually a giving, and it starts with kindness. You want to extend this good information, which ultimately has vital consequences, meaning to say, a Torah life. As an example, when one learns Torah, it makes the person a refined person. He gains information, but Torah information is not only information, it's about transformation. The Torah, someone learns a lot of Torah, the mind becomes more refined, because in the end of the day, the person becomes more refined. For that matter, that says in Pirkei Avos, the ethics of our father, there's not someone who would justifiably call themselves free, only the one, in other words, uninhibited, unlimited, only the one who occupies themselves in learning Torah, because Torah is the word of Hashem, which is the source of all blessing, the source of all authentic energy. And you learn Torah, so you become you're transformed into a better person and a better party. And this is the objective of any educational institution. It's not only just learn academics, but in the end of the day, in a Torah institution, to infuse and imbue the spirit of Torah, the information of Torah, the transformative information of Torah. So you have a teacher which has to teach, and of course it's about kindness. So you could look at it again, that's his job, that's his vocation, he's a teacher, and that's the way he supports his family. Yes, granted. But ultimately, as it's broken down into the actuality, in other words, into focusing on the interaction between the teacher and the student, you have that chesed, that interest in giving, and then there's the gvura, there's the discipline, which you could appreciate it in the teacher-pupil relationship. There always ought to be discipline, and then there's compassion. Sometimes you feel that you got to tune down that discipline, and so on. But then, in the end of the day, this is all a introduction to bringing the information to the mind and heart of the pupil. So that's already, you're crossing a step from emotion to this comes to actuality, in this case, that you start to teach the child. So, and of course, then you have to deliberate how are you going to take this information, many times, even parts of Torah, which you're mandated to teach, and it's important. This is part of the curriculum for this particular class, as an example, this particular type of student. And you know that you have to convey it to him or her, and it must be done, and they walk away with not only as somewhat of a tape recorder to be able to repeat what you said, but really to absorb the information, to become part of them, and they can go on with the next piece of information and the next piece of information, because this is part of the curriculum. As an example, or it could be individually, a father teaching a child. He sits down with a Mishnah, and he knows that the child is capable of understanding and appreciating, perceiving this Mishnah. So he can't just sit down and just rattle off the Mishnah the way it is. He tries to put it into words that the recipient, it's the child or teacher-pupil connection, the pupil should understand it and truly appreciate its information. Sometimes you use a parable, sometimes you have to use certain words, sometimes you have to get the kid's attention, something that they're accustomed to, in order to transmit the information. So there is something which you have to do to deliberate and to consult with yourself how to transmit this which you want to transmit, that the recipient should be able to nicely, comfortably receive the information in a pleasant, harmonious manner. For that matter, this works in every type of giving. Someone knocks on your door, or someone asks someone for charity. You got to deliberate also. Is this going to be good? Is this going to help the person? If someone, take a far extreme, is doing bad stuff with the money, and you're going to give them $10, and you know that in a few seconds they're going to buy something which is destructive to their body, you stop and you deliberate. You deliberate with yourself. And again, the Alter Rebbe is going to show us how that's the subsequent midas of Netzach and Haid. Of course, that's what we're getting at, which is the next midas, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, and then comes Netzach and Haid. The idea of looking at the bigger picture and seeing how can I deliver that the recipient should receive this information or any goods that I want to provide, extend for myself, in a harmonious manner, meaning to say that it should bring the ultimate benefit to the recipient, if it's actual goods, a meal or so, like we mentioned before, or even information, which the Alter Rebbe is using actually the example of information passed down from a teacher to a pupil, as an example, or father to a son, again, in the context of studying with the child. Now, when it comes to, as an example, someone asks and they're truly hungry, this is where you deliberate and you say, what is he going to do if I give him $10? Is he going to do bad stuff to his body? So might as well, and you start thinking, you make a quick decision, and you see there's a nearby restaurant, and of course, if it's a Jew, it has to be a kosher restaurant, as an example, and you say, sure, I want to help you, come in. And you order a good, scrumptious meal for the person, and let him sit down and let him eat, and then you know that your money went to a good place and not to a place which caused destruction to a human body, as an example. So what you did was you aroused a certain compassion, or prior to that, kindness, chesed, gvura, and then there's the compassion experience, and you want to actually help the person. You want to actualize these emotions, that it should be bringing actual benefit to the recipient, to the other party. So you deliberate. And you think about what's the best way to help the other party. But here the Alter Rebbe focuses on intellectual transmission. So when the teacher, when he's ready to go ahead and provide this information to his student, to his pupil, so then he needs to use the Netzach and Haid, which are called the Kloyes Yayatzes, which is sinews, which the Gemara. It's actually Gemara brachis, not the sinews. Sinews are the gidim. The kloyes are the forget the actual translation. You go blank. It'll come back, of course. But the Gemara in brachis says that the what gives the person the ability to deliberate and to consult, to figure a manner, a perfect manner out how another to to be able to consult, that is, with himself, to get the best way to transmit, if it's information or it's goods. The Gemara says these are the kloyos yayatzais. They call them kloyos yayatzais. The Alter Rebbe would say this is the netzach and haid, the two midas. I will just say that whenever I learned this, I never understood netzach. There's more an understanding, as the Alter Rebbe is going to explain himself. The arteries, kloyos are the arteries that yayatzais, that give that suggestion. So the Alter Rebbe here in this the next half a page, he shows you why the netzach is associated with that ability to come to the best conclusion, how to transmit information. The netzach resonates more. Haid, if you think, oh, what's the word haid? Haid is glory, and it's explained so many places of Chassidus where haid, Haid's function in relationship of one fellow to the other fellow human being to another in a different way, and of course the way the Yid expresses it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But interestingly, the Alter Rebbe here doesn't speak about Haid in that manner. Doesn't specify so much why Haid would be the midah, which is ultimately the way the person consults, so to say, deliberates with himself in order to make sure that this which he wants to provide is going to be with a perfect measure and perfect equilibrium, as an example. He doesn't say why Haid, he just generalizes Netzach Haid are the two kloyos yayatzes. Gemara from Brachas, I believe it's Brachas, if I'm not mistaken, it's towards the 58th, 59th page. You have to see there itself why would it be the kloyos yayatzes, but there's whenever the Alter Rebbe later gives another example about another experience within the body, why Netzach and Haid would be corresponding to taking something which is abstract and lofty and making it tangible in order to be that the recipient should be able to have hands-on, if you will. Gives another example. Then he says, associates the Netzach. The Netzach, as we mentioned, with Alter Rebbe's words later, he connects the Netzach to this idea, which resonates more than the Haid. He's very brief with the Haid. So much as I learned this chapter time and again, if anybody wants to write with a better, write to the website, Tanya Roadmap at gmail.com, a little more insight why the Haid. I'm sure it's explained in other places, but when I look at the chapter from face value, I never really appreciated why Haid per se is associated with this experience. But the Alter Rebbe, let's see the Alter Rebbe in his wording over here, and let's try to glean the maximum we can. So the idea that you have to consult with yourself, deliberate with yourself how to bring something into actuality, this resonates immediately, because sometimes you want to give something over and you have such an urge, and you know how much beneficial it is for the recipient, but you look at it on this recipient, the first second you realize, whoa, I got to do some homework with myself. How am I going to take this important information and transmit it? And it should resonate with the recipient, again, if it's the pupil or the son, or for that matter, in any way that you're providing. You're the provider, and then there's the one who's receiving this which you're providing. So we can appreciate it on the onset, but let's see how the Alter Rebbe connects it with these two subsequent midas, which is Netzach and Haid. So let's see it inside. For example, when a master wants to provide an intellectual concept, and here he says actually a father learning with a child, which is again still the teacher pupil. In this case, it's a son. He wants to, again, not as a the father's son connection, love and connection, but in this case it's the father teaching the son, the father as a teacher. He wants to extend this wisdom, this thought, this concept, these insights to his son, if he will convey it the way he understands it, he appreciates it, the child will be lost. It'll go straight over their head, because you're an adult. You learned this probably many times, And of course, the appreciation and the capture and the absorption of an adult and an intellectual concept is very distinct than a child. The adult has a greater capacity to understand, comprehend, appreciate profoundly a concept, especially they put their mind to it, especially somebody who is wise. And in this case, it ought to be a wise father because he's a teacher right now and he's teaching his son. Means to say he has the information thoroughly and he feels that he wants to transmit this information to a child. So of course he has it, he or she has it as a parent, have it, and again, in a very thorough, well-adjusted manner, but because they have it so clear, if they're just going to just rattle off everything they know, and the child, which is totally new to this, will be completely lost on the onset. It'll go straight over his or her head as we know it. So, on the other hand, you don't want to prevent that information from the father does not want to prevent the information from the son because he knows it's a challenge to transmit it to his son. Of course not. The whole point is he wants to teach his son. So this is where the netzach and hayt come in to be able to, so to say, recalibrate, reconfigurate the information in order that you can start perhaps even teaspooning into the child and introducing to them this concept, the way of thinking, the appreciation of the concept and its depth. And the more you see that it's going through, the more you, so to say, push through a lot of quantity of information and quality of information. But that takes consultation. That takes deliberation. That's the netzach and hayt midas when you want to actualize the chesed, gvura, and tiferes. So let's see the Alter Rebbe's words. If you just to say it the way it is, lechol ben la'avi l'kabel. Rak shetzarich l'sada le'beseder ve'inyan ech ve'inyan acher davar dibur al oifnov ma'at. You have to present it in a very orderly fashion, bit by bit. Davar dibur, which means idea by idea, with its structure. And you have to do this ma'at, little by little. It needs no explanation because you're teaching somebody who is new to it, because they're young and they have, first of all, they're not necessarily introduced in the overall to this information. It's the first time they're learning it, but namely they're young and tender, and you have to deal with that fact and deal with that reality. As much as you're excited as a teacher to give it over, it's so important that you pay attention to how this is all going to work, how the recipient will be able to identify with the information, appreciate this information, ultimately absorb this information. This consultation, this deliberation is called netzach v'hayt, which is kloyes yayatzais, which, as we mentioned before, from the Gemara. These are the kloyes which ultimately are the suggesters, if you will. And then he says vigam. So here there's two expressions, vigam and vehein. We can appreciate the vagam because here he talks about the kloyes, and then he talks about another organ in the limb of the human being, which is so we can appreciate vagam. Then the Alter Rebbe, why would there be another version of vehein? Because in the end, probably because they have ultimately the same functions. Alter Rebbe speaks about very clearly of the trei bein amavashtu mazera she'atipa nimshechas me'amayach. So two testicles which ultimately take this, which we know that the seed comes from the mayach of the av, which is literally the brain. As explained, actually, we explained this concept in the second chapter of the Likutei Amorim. The second chapter of Likutei Amorim, it's worthwhile to see it there. And we elaborated a little more. But here, the idea is clear, because in the end of the day, we're talking about a seed which has to produce, ultimately, this fetus. So in the initial, the Alter Rebbe we're going to try to say it in brief, but say it exactly the way the Alter Rebbe is saying over here. In the state where it's an initial state, where the seed comes from, it's intangible. Of course it's intangible. There's nothing tangible there, because then the person, to be say it as it is, and again his mind, his mayach hagashmi would shrink, which of course it doesn't happen, because where it initiates from, in its initial state, where the seed comes from, initiates from. It's of course it's it's an area where the seed itself is totally intangible, and then as it comes down the spine, as it says in a number of places, of course, then it becomes intangible, actual seed, because this has to produce the fetus, etc., etc. So there has to be a change of something which was intangible, an area, in other words, in that whole process, that it became something tangible to an actual seed. So this is the Alter Rebbe talking about. This is this part of the body which Alter Rebbe just mentioned, which ultimately, which really means cook, meaning to say that it makes it tangible, because this is the tipa which comes from the mayach of the av, the mayach of the father, which is and it becomes ultimately that tangible seed which will ultimately produce the fetus, the child, etc. So that Alter Rebbe right away comes back immediately to this, which the Alter Rebbe is trying to convey in the relationship between the teacher and the pupil. In this case, the father, which is trying to transmit a concept to his child in the context of a teacher, that in his mind it's kind of intangible. And of course it is intangible because it's something which is deep in the mind of the teacher. So does it become physically tangible when he puts it over to the student? Of course not. It always remains a concept. But we can see from the parable over here, what Alter Rebbe says, Netzach and Haid, these are the Trein Bein Amevash Nazera. We can understand why this is a parable to this which Alter Rebbe is going to convey, because in the mind of the teacher, it is so subtle, and it's so acutely subtle, and then you want to take that and transmit it to the student will have nothing. You must make it, so to say, a tangible concept, not physically, but figuratively. You must present it, you must dissect it in a way and say, here, like it says about a Shulchan Aruch. The reason why the Shulchan Aruch is called Shulchan Aruch, because that's the whole point of the Shulchan Aruch. They take all these concepts and present it like a prepared table for the people who learn it to be able to absorb it, identify with, and act upon it. So this is where the Alter Rebbe gives this example, and he jumps right over to the Nimshol, to the message, which is the Dvar Chochma. The concept which comes from the intellect of the Father, that it should not manifest, it should not evolve the way it's this subtle, very subtle concept, understood and appreciated by the teacher, but extremely acutely subtle in the mind of the teacher. But it's important that it becomes, so to say, tangible, again, figuratively, that it should change from its subtlety, and and it should produce a concept, an idea that is not that subtle and not that sensitive. In order, sensitive understanding would be the right word. It's not that subtle. It may mean to say that it's in a way that the child, in this case, which is the recipient, the student, should be able, it should become some one way or another tangible, again, conceptually, figuratively rather, and he should be able to absorb in his mind and in his understanding. And now we can see the similarity, as the Alter Rebbe gets back to this example. It's like the seed which comes from the brain. It becomes very, very subtle, and in the end it becomes a very tangible seed. It becomes truly tangible, because it has to be the seed which ultimately would produce. And here you see why the two versions, V'gam and Behem, because Alter Rebbe says the kloyes and the Trein Bein contribute to that procedure of this seed becoming tangible in order to ultimately produce. Alter Rebbe goes on, V'gam netzach v'hoid, and again we understand in the Nimshal, in the message, as we just explained. So here the Alter Rebbe will go on. I think maybe we'd stop over here, but let's see if we can just run another few lines over here, because the Alter Rebbe goes on. The Netzach V'Hoid is also called in Torah Shchokim B'Richaim. It's called the mill, the grinder. And why Netzach V'Hoid called grinder in Kabbalah? Because this says this takes the man, which tzaddikim are privy to the man, meaning to say they had the right, just like the people in the desert, they had that special food coming from heaven, and Hashem wants to provide it to tzaddikim as well, as reward for their effort. So it says that the Netzach and Nahid are called the grinders of the man for the tzaddikim. And what's the point? When you say a grinder, you see how the message is it's synonymous. It's exactly the same, because what's the whole point? Someone grinds wheat in a mill. What does he actually do? He takes that wheat, as an example, a full kernel, that is, of wheat, and he breaks it up into small different pieces. That's exactly the objective of the teacher. And again, the father, which in this case is the teacher, to minimize and ultimately to break it apart. And this, the words of wisdom, which he wants to extend and transmit to his son, to divide it to many pieces, parts, that is, to say it bit by bit, with deliberation and knowledge, and that carefulness as he transmits it. And that is why we understand it in this nimshalness, which we're trying to convey over here. Again, we're trying to do this also in the same manner. But the Alter Rebbe, it brings this, what it says is brought in a number of places. The Netzach V'Hoid are called the grinders for the tzaddikim. And you see this message coming across in its exact form, meaning to say, this is the point of the Netzach V'Hoid, to take something which is a little abstract or much abstract and bring it down, dissect it. Again, that's what the grinder does. It dissects the matter. In the case of the chitim, of the wheat, the kernel, it takes the kernel, it breaks it apart. In the context of the seichel, it dissects the seichel in order to bring it, to transmit it to the student. And then the Alter Rebbe will go on. We'll learn this as well. We'll stop over here. We'll learn this next week. Another component of Netzach. And this we see the direct connection of Netzach. Netzach literally means to triumph, to be victorious. In this case, the teacher kind of has to triumph over him or herself in order to be determined not to get lost, perhaps sometimes with a frustration that I know I have to do this. And the child, even an obeying child, a behaving child, a child which is interested to learn, but because I really see the contrast between my appreciation of this concept and the child's young and tenderness over here, and therefore the difficulty to start appreciating this new concept, which is new for the child, and sometimes I can get frustrated. Not necessarily overtly frustrated, but inside I want to give up. So there's the netzach, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say, that I have to triumph over myself and say, no, this is going to happen. And when one uses that netzach, of course, that's the only way it'll ultimately happen. As we'll learn next week, thus netzach becomes a very important component of crossing the line of all my interest to transmit, to actually successfully transmit, and it again it'd be understood, perceived, appreciated, and excited by the pupil, by the student. Have a wonderful evening.